This is The Final Word with Adam Collins and Geoff Lemon. We have a interview to present this week, which is one that we've been looking forward to recording for a long time. And indeed, I'm sat in the seat of where Eleanor Oldroyd spoke to us just a moment ago. We swapped positions, so if you're watching on YouTube, you might wonder why it's odd that you're seeing my left cheek now and my right cheek later, but that's the reason for that. But Geoff, before getting to Eleanor...
Because Adam always turns the other cheek.
He does.
If a man strikes him on one cheek, he turns his other cheek to him and lets him strike him there also.
You have no idea how accurate that is. But the interview component of this show, which was going to be up the front, we're going to put it at the back because in the last couple of hours, Geoff, there have been a number of developments in India with the IPL. Of course, we covered these issues exhaustively last week, be it through our conversation with Glenn Maxwell, our conversation with Karinya Keshav, but the IPL, as we conceived of it a week ago, is no longer.
As we know it, yeah. The official language is that it's been suspended or postponed, as tends to be the language for these things. But as best we can tell at the moment, look, we're recording this on Tuesday. It'll come out on Wednesday, by which time a lot of things could have changed. So we're not even going to try to, make this a news kind of episode because the story will change. But as far as we know, overseas players are likely to go home. Local players are likely to return to their homes, and there'd be concerns about that for a fair few people, I imagine, who may be more secure in the bubble that they were in. But the IPL bubble was breached. A number of players and team staff members tested positive for COVID, and it's become untenable with 4 different teams at the moment implicated in that to continue.
Yeah, and it felt, Geoff, and we had this conversation last week, as I say, but once it was breached in one part, that it was almost inevitable that the other positive cases would follow suit, and that's been the steady trickle of news today. So yesterday it was about one game being postponed, and now it's an indefinite suspension of the competition as other clubs have had to record their positive cases.
Yeah, coastal erosion kind of stuff. It all fell pretty quickly once it started falling. So 2 KKR players testing positive on the Monday in Sandeep Warrior and Varun Chakravarti. That team was in isolation. KKR's game for the Monday was postponed. Then 2 Chennai Super Kings staff tested positive. CSK was supposed to play on Wednesday. That game was postponed. And then Ridham and Saha from Sunrisers Hyderabad as well. So that meant the Sunrisers game, which was supposed to be on the Tuesday, was postponed. So you had 3 games in a row that were all gone. And the Delhi Capitals were already in isolation because they'd played Kolkata. And then they had Amit Mishra test positive as well. So, 4 different teams all caught up in that.
So the BCCI were already looking at moving the whole show to Mumbai, where there's 3 available grounds and they can sort of stitch the whole thing together. That seems to be where this might be moving if they do try and kick this back off again, maybe next week. I mean, it seems so difficult to make predictions at this stage, but if they're going to have another crack at this, I can't see how it would be requiring further travel.
I think it's unlikely that that'll happen in the short term, given that there's such a crush for Indian national players who need to go to England to play the World Test Championship final. The overseas players are likely to be getting out as soon as possible, except for the Australian players who aren't allowed to come back to Australia at the time that we're recording, which seems pretty absurd that that's the case. But the statement that the IPL, that the BCCI put out, said that it's imperative that the tournament is now suspended and everyone goes back to their families and loved ones. So that would suggest that it's more likely to be a postponement that might be resumed in a matter of months rather than a matter of days or weeks.
Yeah, and this was always the chance that if the bubble ended up falling apart as it has, that once you're out of it, you can't get back into it for the obvious reasons. And I mean, there's so many layers to this, isn't there? The political side of it, the fact that the BCCI essentially saved the summer in Australia, the fact that the ECB are anticipating that the Indian team will do likewise this year for the 5 test matches and white ball games they'll play in the UK through the middle part of the summer. That can't be divorced from all of this, can it? That these boards have been essential to keeping each other afloat, the big 3 that is, or at least allegedly keeping each other afloat through this tough time. And now the CA and the ECB and every other board as well, don't get me wrong, have to make decisions with that it won't be at the back of their mind. They will know that they can't avoid disrupting the peace at this really crucial period of time. Whether that's right or wrong, I'm sure that'll be the reality.
Well, none of the other boards wanted to be the active, the instigator in pulling their players out of the IPL, but they'll probably be pretty relieved that they now can do that.
Yeah.
But it didn't seem crazy to me to try to keep the league going as long as the bubble was intact. Like, that seemed like there wasn't that much downside to it. Like, you might as well, while it was working, see if you could make it keep working, because the players who were there were already there. You couldn't magic them home. They were already in that situation. The thing that did seem crazy was continuing to move cities, trying to stick to that plan of having the sort of roving circus, on the road, rather than getting all of the 8 teams to one place, and and preferably a smaller, quieter sort of city, rather than it did seem like madness to be taking teams and matches to Delhi, for instance, given just how badly Delhi's been absolutely smashed by COVID at the moment. That seemed to be inviting trouble, and that's what's happened with it, having got into that bubble in Delhi.
A lot of attention on the Australian response, and we touched on this with Glenn Maxwell last week about the travel ban. I think that had been issued 3 or 4 hours before we caught up with Glenn, and he explained his position and the position, I suppose, of the players at large, of course in coordination with the Australian Cricketers Association when they made their commentary last week too. But this travel ban does complicate matters considerably. It means that the idea of just getting the Australian players home, that's not possible. So they're now in a situation where they could stick around in India. We don't know what the situation would be on that front, given there'll be no more bubble as such. Maybe they can go to a third party. Maxi hinted towards that with us last week about maybe they could get on the charter that will eventually come to the UK with the Indian players, the English players and the New Zealand players ahead of the test matches here through June and July. That picked up a little bit of coverage at the time, because that's quite a creative solution. But now that there's no competition through the end of May, I suppose they'll be waiting to take their cues from other countries as to what they can do in the short term instead of being stuck in this COVID hotspot.
Yeah, very much so. So it's the 4th of May, the date when the competition's been called off. The Australian border, in theory, doesn't open again, or can't open until May the 16th, but that ban might be extended as well. So they're stuck in that situation with the way things are at the moment. Unless the Australian government backs down on that border ban, then they could be in India for another 9 days. Then you would imagine that the BCCI would do whatever it could to look after foreign players who are still there, if that's required. But yeah, it's a matter of whether they try to get out to the UK, whether they try to get out to somewhere like Qatar or an intermediate spot. There are various countries that have closed the borders to India, and it's just this insane sort of this cowardice from the Australian government that they haven't bothered setting up adequate quarantine facilities, which means that people who were given government approval to leave the country are being blocked by the same government from re-entering the country. And I've seen some absolute ludicrous nonsense, like things like some of the replies to Michael Slater hopping on Twitter and having a crack at the Australian government. I think it's the first time he's tweeted in about 3 years. Having a look at that account, it doesn't get much of a run. But the number of people replying saying, "Oh, you just went there for the money." Yeah, people work overseas, dickhead. Like, a lot of people have jobs that require them to travel, and that's how they make a living. And if they apply to the government to be given an exemption to leave the country, and the government says you can do that, then it's not a reasonable thing to expect that as a citizen of a country you will be blocked from returning to your own country. That's not a thing that is supposed to happen. That's not a thing you're supposed to have to consider. And the idea that, oh, well, you knew the risks you were taking. The situation in India a couple of months ago looked pretty good. There was COVID, but this wave came up fast, and by the time it got really bad, people were stuck there. So it just seemed absolutely bizarre that there's this kind of antagonism towards people saying we should be allowed to return to our own country in one way or another. Yeah,
so we addressed some of this with Glenn last week, but the Michael Slater critique was a lot sharper, I suppose, saying the PM has blood on his hands, was going to throw it into the,
potentially
into the political realm.
Because people people in India where there's no medical support will die if they catch COVID.
Yeah.
The Australian citizens will die if they catch it because they won't be able to access medical support. That just will happen.
Yeah, and it underlined that really important point you made, Geoff, that they've been permitted an exemption to leave the country by the federal government, not by the state government, who have been running quarantines on the federal government's behalf for however many months it's been now. The fact that there haven't been federal quarantine facilities, it's really exposed that failure, which isn't about cricket, it's about the community. But we're now in a situation where the cricketers are kind of amongst those who are in the toughest spots. I mean, it reinforced that Adam Zampa and Kane Richardson made a pretty good decision last week, although they were maligned for it. The criticism that they snuck through the back door, and the relationship between that conversation and the Prime Minister coming out and issuing the travel ban almost immediately. It's impossible to divorce those two stories. And then Paul Rifle, who was 10 minutes away from leaving the bubble, the umpire who used to play for Australia but now working in the IPL. Had he left the bubble, he would have been in all sorts. He would have been quite exposed, but instead he stayed put, didn't get out, and so be it. And Michael Slater, I suppose, is the most recent example of someone who's gotten out of India, but now obviously won't be able to get back to Australia for, well, really, who knows? He's in the Maldives, where it's not as though that's free of COVID.
Yeah, exactly that. So in theory, he'd be allowed entry from there after 2 weeks have elapsed, and so he'll be okay. It's not that drastic a situation, but you're thinking about the people without the resources
yes.
That the cricketers have access to, without BCCI support and so on, who are in a place where if they're in cities particularly where the hospitals are full and supplies are being exhausted, then they're in a very dangerous spot, as are all of the citizens of India. Obviously, there are millions of people at risk, but just looking at this through the lens of an Australian government needing to look after Australian citizens, that is something that a national government is for. It's not to say that they have to put on RAAF planes and fly over and bail everybody out.
And the ACA and CA are saying that, but sorry to jump in, but it's worth repeating. Nobody is suggesting that. Nobody is suggesting that Australian cricketers should jump some metaphorical queue. So, again, it's easy to whack the players and whack the people associated with the IPL for participating in a league where they could make a lot of money. And that is the case for some of them, sure, like Pat Cummins and Glenn and others who went for huge auction prices, but it's not the case for everybody who's over there. But even that's...
Yeah, I'm tipping that Ben Cutting's not making huge money over there. Of
course not.
Or, there are a bunch of players who get picked up for their base price, or maybe they get picked up for $100,000 and it looks pretty good, but half of that goes, 20% of it goes to CA, 10% of it goes to their agent, 30% of it goes on tax, and they end up making a few tens of thousands of dollars. And yeah, it's a good payday, but it's not a life-changing payday, and it's not you can afford to charter a private jet home payday.
Yeah, that's right. So there's the chartering a jet home story, which, again, we talked about this last week, but the suggestion that Cricket Australia might try and do something like that, look, that might happen, who knows? But it certainly won't be happening before the 15th or 16th of May. That's the important point here. It's not as though they're going to be airlifting them out of Hanoi sort of style situation. This is not what we're talking about here. So I hope there is a degree of measured reporting on that from those who are sort of seemingly outside of the cricket landscape, because it is easy to beat up on wealthy cricketers. I totally get that, but that's not what this is about, and hopefully that was made pretty clear by Glenn last week. Pat Cummins is one of those wealthy Australian cricketers who is using his muscle for good. We talked about his pledge of $50,000 last week, which was the catalyst for a number of other players doing the same, and Cricket Australia starting their fund with UNICEF. I think they've chipped in $50,000 to kick it off. And Cummins himself, Geoff, and you were all over this last week, decided to send it to UNICEF as well instead of the PM Cares Fund in India, which had hairs all over it.
Yeah, there was a fund closely tied to the Indian Prime Minister Modi, where there wasn't any transparency on what that money was being spent on, and that strangeness of getting donations to a fund that has a politician's name on it as though he's the one giving the money out. It just doesn't smell right. None of that did. So I think a number of people communicated with Pat Cummins about that, and he's decided to be more politically neutral, I suppose, on where that money goes and have it go through UNICEF instead. So he does his best to do the right thing most of the time, Pat Cummins. He's an admirable human being.
In theory, when the Australian players return, Geoff, they'll be home for 14 days of quarantine at some stage, and then they will have to regroup and go off again to the West Indies, potentially Bangladesh for white ball tours, and then a number of them to the UK for the 100. I mean, I suppose the events of the last week have reinforced how tricky this is going to be, and how nimble they're going to have to be, and how much time away from their family this is really going to mean in 2021. And look, we were talking to Marcus Stoinis about this in January, but now that we know, we know what we know about India and the situation over there, it'll feel quite daunting for a number of those players without any clarity, complete uncertainty, I suppose, about the next few months in their lives.
And the indications from Cricket Australia are that they will take that into account. Notionally, the IPL happens in players' free time, like that's their leave period, and they can choose to go and make money in the IPL if they want. But you've got to be realistic that it's probably been quite a harrowing experience in its own way.
Yeah.
Nothing compared to what's going on outside the luxury hotels, of course, and nothing compared to what's going on in the hospital wards and all of the rest of it. But still, having that anxiety, living with that anxiety of seeing the world burn outside your window really is going to have had an effect. So they may be sensible with selections and so on in giving a break to some players who might have been on that trip in ordinary times. It probably doesn't matter too much what the makeup of those squads will be, I suppose, because it's probably not sustainable for players to come home for such a short period of time and then go off again immediately. And there are issues with that West Indies tour as well, where there's been a volcanic explosion in St Vincent. Just to follow on from 2020 being a great year, 2021's just doing the business as well, which means they might not be able to land planes, so they may have to change where those matches are being played and so on.
Yeah, and I suppose they're fulfilling their commitments to the World Cup Super League there, but they're also preparing for the T20 World Cup in October. It almost seems trite to talk about the suitability for India to host a global tournament right now. But we've seen briefed out during the week, Geoff, from those close to the BCCI that their preferred venue, if they can't host it, will be the UAE. But this jarred with me. Why is it up to the BCCI to influence where a subsequent tournament might be held? Surely that's the responsibility of the ICC, and they can make a call, and maybe it ends up in Dubai anyway. That would be logical, I suppose, if they're starting again with a blank piece of paper. But still, I mean, the sense that the BCCI have been putting in place contingency plans with the UAE, that doesn't feel quite right to me.
Yeah, it's odd that that's where the information's coming from, but maybe that's just the journalists have leakier sources in one organisation than the other. It does puzzle me what benefit there could be for India to host that tournament. The one thing that the home board gets out of it is the gate receipts and the corporate hospitality boxes and all of that. That's how they make money out of an ICC global event, because all the broadcast revenue goes to the ICC. So what benefit there could be staging the thing in the UAE rather than putting it off for a year and trying to stage it with crowds in, I can't see that, but I'm sure they have their own ideas.
A lot's going to change in this story in the next 24, 48, 72 hours and beyond. So we probably should just move off this topic, because we could keep talking all day about it, and some of it will be relevant when this is published, some of it probably won't. But I suppose our intention of trying to steer clear of the IPL this week, it would have been disingenuous for us to have immediately jumped into that aforementioned interview, which is going to be great with Eleanor Oldroyd, the BBC. How can you describe Ellie? We'll give it a crack later when we go into the interview, but one of the most influential voices in English journalism, specifically in cricket. So we've really enjoyed chatting to her. Before getting to that, there have been a couple of test matches played in the last week. One of those was in Harare between Zimbabwe and Pakistan. I don't propose that we talk about that today in depth. We might come back to it after they've finished their second test during the week, but it was all over in 3 days. Pakistan thumped Zimbabwe. Fawad Alam made a century and Hassan Ali took 9 wickets. The game that
I do want to note though that that Fawad Alam now has 400s and no 50s, so he's got to 54 times, and then has gone on to 100 every one of those times. And you know I love a player with more hundreds and 50s. So imagine if that kept going. Imagine if he gets like 2300s and no 50s. God, it'd be a great day.
I hope it's the case that when we talk about that series in depth this time next week, that it's 5-0 or 6-0 twin tons in the second test, perhaps for Fawad Alam. The second test at Kandy, though, between Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, we thought it might be another boring draw. It wasn't another boring draw because Sri Lanka won by 209 runs. Karunaratne, our boy, made his second century of the series in a big first innings tally of 493 for 7. Karunaratne 118. Thuramana 140, so a 209 run opening stand. The other man we were talking about.
Your favourite.
Earlier this year.
ever since you sledged it, ever since you were like, it's hilarious that this guy still has a career, averages about 22 from 10 years of Test cricket. He's just been on an absolute spree.
Good on him.
He's just made runs everywhere against everyone.
No, I love it. I love it. I also love the fact that Dikwela...
Oh, you were right. I mean, you were dead right.
Narisha Dikwela, 77 not out from 72 balls, doing the team thing, but again, not quite getting to 3 figures at Test level. I think he's the opposite of Fawad Alam. Maybe he's got 15 Test half centuries now or something like that without saluting for 3 figures. And Bangladesh were all out 251 in the first innings. Brisk runs for Tamim Iqbal again, but he didn't have a huge amount of support. Praveen Jayavikrama on debut, 6 for 92 in the first innings with his left arm orthodox. Ended up taking 11 for the match when they bowled out Bangladesh for 227. The second time around, Karunaratne made runs for Sri Lanka in their second innings when they were batting for declaration runs, and all told a convincing win for Sri Lanka at home. They take the series 1-0.
And I noticed after that 11 for Jayavikrama, there was a photo popped up with a caption, something like the successor to Murali and Rangana Herath. I was like, oh, fuck off. Like, no pressure. He's played one test match. Leave him alone. Like, I mean, Herath took, 432 wickets? Like, you can't... He's got 11. No, leave him be. Leave him be.
We had this earlier in the year as well, didn't we? When Sri Lanka bowled out England in that first test match. Like, well, we've got our replacement. We've got our spin department all sorted out.
Yeah, he's Embaldenia.
That's right. Embaldenia was the player in question there. But yes, high-scoring games, both of them. And Zimbabwe, Pakistan have their second test at Harare, the Harare Sports Stadium, I think it is, which begins midweek. And we'll talk about it next week. Geoff, before we go to our break and our feature interview, it was another bonkers round in the county championship. Been really blessed with 4 rounds of cricket where there's been very little rain.
#blessed.
#blessed, that's right. Very little rain through April, so 4 rounds through that stretch of time where there's been a lot of results. So just 1 draw out of the 9 games this week. 1 2-dayer, a couple finished in 3, and then a couple of crazy 4th-day finishes as well.
2-dayer?
Yeah, there was a 2-dayer. And Marnus was involved in that too, I should add. But we'll start with the thriller. Okay. Northants were 1 run away from tying Yorkshire. There have been 67 ties in first-class cricket, and I keep my eye on that Wikipedia page quite often. Whenever a game's getting close, I'm like, maybe this could be number 68. But and that's been since 1783, I should add. So it's a big body of work where there've only been 68 instances of it. But yes, Northants, at one stage they were 206 for 9, chasing 218 when the rain came. So I was watching the stream, and as Ben Sanders was walking out at number 11, it started pissing it down at Headingley. And when they got back, he hit a boundary first ball. I think he was there with Wayne Parnell. But yes, when they were 1 run short, when they were 216 all out, I think it worked out to be, when Steve Patterson, the Yorkshire captain, took the final wicket. So a 1-run result, it leads to which was the best game of the round. It was a scrap the whole way through. The 2-day game you talked about, Kent were rolled for 138 and 74 against Glamorgan. Michael Hogan, the Australian who played some Shield cricket about 10 years ago and turns 40 next month, he took 5 for 28. But the other Australian playing in that game, Marnus Labuschagne, Geoff, you'll love the fact that he was out to Darren Stevens' leg before wicket for 11. The day before Steve-O turned 45, he went on to complete a 5-wicket bag, 5 for 53 on his 45th birthday. So we had Final Word friends on Twitter asking Andrew Sampson who is the oldest player to take a 5-wicket bag on their birthday. On his birthday.
There'd be heaps of old spinners.
Well, there's a 50-year-old. The 50-year-old is the benchmark. So maybe we'll see Darren still kicking around in 5 years' time. It won't surprise you to hear that Surrey bounced back after Middlesex towed them up last week and slaughtered Hampshire by an innings and 289 runs at the Oval. But how's about this? So they bowl out Hampshire. Sorry, Geoff.
Can I just give you one thing here? Marnus, Darren Stevens 45. It wouldn't be very often that you, as a professional cricketer, got out to someone whose age was higher than your average, but he nearly did. Marnus is averaging 46 in first-class cricket.
Maybe someone can work that out at some point, like per Sam Ashworth a couple of weeks ago with the Caps. Yes, that game at Surrey at the Oval, they bowled out Hampshire for 92, so you're thinking, green top, Surrey will be up against it, especially with Mohammed Abbas and Kyle Abbott as the opening bowlers. No, they made 560 for 7 in reply, declared, and after making a pair last week, Hashim Amla, 215 retired hurt. He woke up with shaggers back after completing his double ton and didn't continue his innings. Ollie Pope made 131. I think Ollie Pope's average at the Oval is now 103, and his average against Hampshire is like 99 or something ridiculous. Bradman-esque figures there from the young England tyro. And in the second innings, Hampshire out for 179, and Kemar Roach rocks up and picks up 8 for 40, the West Indian speedster, his best figures in first-class cricket, to finish the job there. So he's a really good signing for them there at the Oval. And the other game I wanted to highlight was Gloucestershire, who... They were a Division 2 county back in 2019. They're currently being coached by the freak Ian Harvey, who had to step in at the last minute because Richard Dawson's taken a role with the ECB. And he's led them to the top of the table in Group 2, and they hauled down 348 on the final day against Leicestershire. That's their third successful chase this season. Ian Cobain made 117 and Tom Lace 97. So they play Middlesex at Lords this week, the game I'll be at, so looking forward to seeing them in action. Daniel Worrell, of course, playing for Gloucestershire from an Australian perspective. And as I sign off when we move on, Notts won their first game for 3 years against Derbyshire this round. Haseeb Hameed, we were talking a lot about him last week. He was out second ball of the match, just to do as they always do after you talk them up for 4 days. But he did back up with 94 in the second innings, and Stuart Broad was really important in that final innings too. So he's just getting his the miles in the legs for a new international summer. So yes, some great results in the championship and a fantastic month to start the season.
Very good. Thank you, Adam. I know you've been excitedly watching all 9 streams at the same time. Before we get to the middle part, the little breather part of the show, let's have a quick little round of Nerd Pledge. Nerd Pledge. Nerd Pledge. The game that we play with people on our Patreon page. They support the show by sending us small amounts of currency that are a number that relate to cricket, and we have to work out what that number means. That's how it works. And the first is... Well, the only number.
The one and only.
Is a double header.
Yes, and that number is 210. So Matt from the Gabba, who's been a regular correspondent of ours in recent times, is in with his first pledge, and MJ Knoester, one of our Dutch correspondents. She's been with us before, but because she was down the list and had the same number as Matt, she appears on the show this week. It's neat like that, your cue. There's one way to jump it, and MJ Knoester has done precisely that. Matt at the Gabba, Geoff, has a clue for us. He had the pledge 219 ready to go when an unbelievable event occurred that prompted a change to 210. But since none of your 4-way guesses included my 219, I'll be very excited to change my pledge after you guess my 210. Of course, 219 was the number we were looking at recently. Geoff, why would have Matt changed his number from 219 to 210 on account of an unbelievable event?
In a moment of great excitement, in a fit of pleasure, Matt would have done that on the night of, I can't remember when it was, maybe it was January or early Feb.
It was during the first test match where England were playing India. It was during our live pub show of our little sort of attempted watch along.
And he did that because 210 was a score that Kyle Mayers made for the West Indies that night. Now, I know that because I noticed the pledge come in at the time on the day, and I thought, 210, I know what that's about. I know when that comes around in a couple of months' time, I'm going to nail this first shot. And here we go. It is the night that Kyle Mayers made 210 for the West Indies in one of the biggest run chases of all time. One of the most bananas test innings ever played, I think, because we know that chasing 395 runs is ridiculous in the fourth innings of a test match. Doing that in Bangladesh against the home team with a bunch of spinners should be impossible. There have only been 4 bigger run chasers in Test history in 150 odd years. But for 210 of the runs to be made by a player who is on debut in the 4th innings, who hit 7 sixes along the way, is beyond ridiculous. So if you didn't catch this story at the time, very briefly, the summary, Kyle Mayers was basically a bowling all-rounder. Bowled more than batted, and wasn't really in West Indies contention until he had one big first-class season with the bat and averaged 50-odd. And then there was a big shortage of players who didn't want to go to Bangladesh during when the COVID crisis was really starting to arc up. And so Kyle Mayers was willing to go, and he got to bat at number 5 in the Test team. This would not have happened in other circumstances, right? And then he goes on to make 210 in a run chase of 395. 210 not out, I should specify. So to give you some context, there have been 119 centuries on debut. Like, that's not that rare, because there are lots of players who are, they're cherry ripe when they get into a Test team, they're good to go, and they make 100 at the first time of asking, right? So 119 tons on debut, only 6 of them have been double centuries. So players at the first time of asking don't tend to go on to 200. Kyle Mayers was the 7th. None of those double centuries were in the 4th innings, though. Players who made a ton on debut in the 4th innings, out of 119 of them, 8. 8 had done it before Kyle Mayers. And they were all small hundreds. So 105 had been made 3 times, 106, 109, 110, 112, and 117. Leslie Cook in a women's test had the highest score before Mayers on debut in the 4th innings. And then he comes along and makes 210, like nearly double the next best. Absolutely ridiculous. And out of those 8 debut centuries in the 4th innings of a test, 3 of them were in lost causes, 4 of them were in draws, and only 1 of them actually came in a win, and that was about 20 years earlier when Yasir Hamid made twin tons in a match against a much, much worse Bangladesh team playing in Pakistan. So Yasir, Tip Foster and Lawrence Rowe were the only players to make more runs in a match in their first Test match, because Kyle Mayers made 40 in the first innings and made 250 in the Test match. And this is a guy who averaged 28 in first-class cricket before that game. So what a night, and no wonder it made an impression on Matt near the Gabba.
Oh, what a night. Late December back in 63. Kyle Mayers, yeah, that's the most striking part, isn't it, your final line? His average at first-class level was 28 before striking 210 on debut. Remarkable. Looking forward to watching his career or following it closely, as we will on the final word. MJ Knoester also came with a clue, so thank you, Matt. Her clue was that it is something the Netherlands have only done once in the history of cricket. I went further and said, is it maybe the only team to beat a Test team once? He said, not really, but kind of, sort of. So I was warm. And then where we got to was that the Netherlands women have only played 1 Test match, and that was against South Africa in 2007. Of the current lot of South African players, only a very young baby Shabnim Ismail at age 18 and Trisha Chetty, who just turned 19, were in that 11. The Netherlands did okay. They bowled them out for 232. They only made 108 in reply, but batting a second time, they set the Netherlands 210 to win, which is pretty generous when you think about it. Just said, after being so far ahead in the game, they only said, well, look, you go and get 210 and you can have the win, despite the fact they had like a 140 run first innings lead. But anyway,
there wasn't much time left, I reckon, because they tended to play short affairs, and if you wanted to win, you really had to go.
Had the chance to hand. Then it worked anyway. They bowled out Netherlands for 50, so the batting was the real problem. For the Dutch, they were completely trounced in that 4th innings, and unfortunately, they never got the opportunity to improve because they haven't played Test cricket since. But the target they had in that Test was 210.
That, I suspect, is going to be MJ's number. So that's Nerd Pledge. If you want to play, if you want to send us a number and have us try to work out what it means, very easy. Go to patreon.com/thefinalword, make an account, set a pledge, and in doing so, you can help support the show and help let us put the time into it that we do week in, week out.
All right, thank you, Geoff. That's the end of part 1. Let's take a breather. Let's talk about some satellite communication technology and return with one of our favourite people in the cricketing world, Eleanor Oldroyd.
In the world, just in the whole world, just in the big world, probably in space, maybe in all of space, maybe in the universe.
Geoff, improving, we've recorded this episode in sequence, talking about outer space. That's where the satellites connect to from the Zolio that you can put into your pocket. Zolio, tell us about them.
The most beautiful satellite communication device in the cosmos.
Including the two black holes.
And if you have ever thought, man, I wish my satellite, my ordinary smartphone was a satellite technology device, then it can be. It can be turned into one with this helpful little box. It's called a Zolio. It's in my hand right now. It's like half the size of my hand. I have big hands, but imagine that. Imagine someone with big hands. It sits comfortably on the palm. It's like like if you got a block of Mersey Valley cheese and someone had taken a couple of pretty generous slices off it and then gave you the rest. That's what you'd have. That sort of size. You feeling?
Yeah, well, you do have big hands. I was measuring Winnie's feet this morning alongside my big toe, and my big toe is still bigger than her entire foot. So, Winnie couldn't pick it up. Well, she could pick it up. I mean, she's been going the Shahid Afridi and picking up the cricket ball and sticking it in her mouth and trying to take a bite out of it, like an apple, bless her. But it wouldn't take up the whole surface size of her little hand. But still, the point remains, this is a comparatively small box to carry around with you for a considerable payoff if you're in the business of staying connected in places you otherwise might not be able to.
Yep, it's quite lightweight. But if you were, say, trapped outside of the country because your national government had barred you from re-entry, for instance, something like that, and you were in another country where you didn't have ready access to local SIM cards and networks and all of the rest of it, and you really needed a way to be able to send text messages or emails to someone, you could do it with this box. You could do it if you were stuck on a mountain somewhere. You can do it if you're on a raft. You can get it any old.
Matter of fact, you got it now.
And
it shows how broken our brains are that as soon as you started that, we both went to exactly the same place.
Of course we did. So it's a pretty basic concept, which is that you can't always connect your phone to be able to send a message in textual form or in voice form. But when you have this thing, you can send a message from anywhere on the planet to anywhere on the planet. You just turn it on and it starts talking to your smartphone, and it connects to an app on your phone, and then that app will let you send a message in written form to any email address or any phone number in the entire world. Done. And it's not like, it then charges you $80 for the privilege. You just sign up with a per month subscription, and then your messages are included, and it's all fine. And it uses the geostationary satellite network. No, the not geostationary satellite network, the one that's 800 kilometres above us, and it beams your message to that thing 800 kilometres up and then down to someone else's phone or computer. Magic.
Without giving anything away, when we talk to Ellie in a moment, part of our conversation involves the technology she used when she was first reporting on cricket way back when. We talked about the sort of nostalgic idea of communicating, not necessarily abusive letters. That's the downside that we reflected on about how crazies might tell you how shit you were or how shit they thought you were some time ago. But nonetheless, I see it this way. So many advertisements these days are about dating apps and about how you can make your profile better to attract a potential life partner or one night partner if that's your go, whatever it is, whatever type of partner you want.
That's part of your life.
The apps have that provision.
That's a bit of your life.
Well, what about
life doesn't specify how much.
Well, what about when we were younger? There were none of this app business. You had to send an SMS. There was no WhatsApp. There was no Facebook Messenger or whatever it is. DMs didn't exist. You just sent an old-fashioned, bog-standard SMS. You up ? Late drink ? I like the idea that what the Zolio is doing is taking us back to the roots of roots when it comes to connecting with people late at night. Look, that's my point. It's a nice thing. It's a throwback.
Yep. I mean, look, the only flaw in your plan is that if you're far enough away that you need a Zolio, you're unlikely to be able to get to that person in time to make anything of the opportunity. The plus side, though, is that if you're somewhere far enough away to need a Zolio, you are going to seem much more interesting to that person. You're not just texting them from Clapham Common, or Dandenong or whatever, you're texting them. You're like, oh, just texting you with my satellite phone because, I'm on one of the Andes and there's no reception here. And that A, makes you seem interesting, and B, makes it seem like more of a commitment to that person that you have sent them a message with this. That's what really, really sends the thrill, because they're like, wow, they went to all the trouble of sending me a message using a satellite phone network. In the old days, if you wanted something to go 800 kilometres up into space, you had to take it yourself. You had to pack a lunch and you had to get up there. But now you can just send it with one of these boxes. So, Zolio, ZOLEO.com. That's the thing. Check it out.